project for November's Fabulous Quilters Club is the Jolly Christmas Cracker Table Topper. This quilt project uses foundation paper piecing for both the crackers and the presents. I have a small Christmas tree to put in the centre of mine, which will give a lovely festive feel to my Christmas table. These are the fabrics I'm using for today's project. They're all from Lewis and Irene. So I've got 3 bumbleberries here. The first one is custard. Then we've got retro red and woodland. And then this last one here is a cream background with a metallic gold star on it. And it's called Little Star, and the range is Peace and Joy. So that's what I will be doing my foundation paper piecing with today. So these are the sheets you're going to need for your foundation paper piecing. So for the cracker block, you're going to need to print off 4 sheets. And for the Christmas present block, you're going to also need to print off 4 sheets. Now with the Christmas present one, you've actually got 2 of the presents printed on each sheet. But you will need to have 4 presents that go either side of your main block in the middle that has the crackers on. So that's why you're going to need 4 sheets printed with 2 presents on each sheet. And then I have printed the corner pieces, or the background piece if you like, for the cracker block onto some card. And I'm going to cut this out along the cutting line, just here, the little dotted line. And I'm going to use this as a template to cut out these shapes on the gold and cream fabric that we're using for the background. So you're going to need 8 of these triangles all together. And I'm going to cut those out of this fabric first of all before I move on to do the foundation paper piecing. That is so as I know I have got enough of the fabric for these background pieces. The pieces for the FPP on your printed sheets are quite small, so there should be enough in a fat quarter to do all of your piecework. The first thing we need to do is to cut out our FPP pattern pieces. So you should have your 4 sheets for your crackers and 4 sheets for your Christmas presents. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave a margin around each of these pieces that I'm going to cut out. That's so as when we place the fabric on the top of the paper, I know it will be covering the seam allowance. But when we get to that part of putting the fabric onto the paper, then it will become more clear as to why I'm doing that. So first of all, I'm going to cut out all 8 sheets and I'm going to put them in order. So all the pieces together for the 4 different crackers, and the same with the Christmas present block. As well as the fabrics you're going to need for this project, there are a few tools you will also need to have by your side. So I have 2 rotary cutters. One I'm using for the fabric only, and then this one has an old blade in it, which I use for cutting the paper and the fabric away when we're trimming our templates. I've got some tweezers to help take the paper template off the back of the fabric, some scissors, a seam roller. I've got a sew line glue pen. The lid's quite tough to get off, so that's going to be used at the beginning to place our first piece of fabric onto our template. And then I have my first cracker. So I'm going to do my 4 crackers first of all, and then I'll move on to the presents. To enable you to tear the paper off the back of the fabric when you're finished, you need to have your sewing machine set so it's a 1.5 stitch length, and then this will enable you to pull the paper off the back easily. You'll see once we move along to that stage. I have grouped my cracker pieces together, so I have 4 sets of the crackers, so I can see then where I'm going, and I've put them in numerical order, so I'm going to do them from A to H. So starting with template A, you need to find your number 1, and the number 1 on this one is going to be the background fabric. So you can either use your fabric pieces in larger pieces like this to pop it on, which I'll show you, or if you want to, you can cut smaller pieces. Now what you are aiming to do, especially with this piece because it's actually on the side and it goes into the seam allowance, you want to make sure that that piece of fabric that is covering that has got the 1/4 inch seam allowance that goes all the way around, so these 3 sides here. And then where your seam allowance is here, the reason we've left a little margin is so you will pop your fabric on that goes into that margin, and then that means that you have then covered your seam allowance, because you need to make sure it is covered. If you end your fabric within the seam allowance, you're not going to have enough to sew your pieces together at the end. So for the first one, I'm going to cut a piece off here that will cover A1. It doesn't matter what shape you cut, just as long as you know that it's going to cover that piece. So what you could do is you could lay it onto your fabric and make sure that you have got it covered. So this side I can see that there is a good seam allowance there, and here there's plenty there. So I'm just going to eyeball it underneath. Just going to trim that end. In fact, that was quite handy because I'd got this diagonal cut there. So I'm going to cut that off. And then with my little glue stick, you need to turn your template over, and where A1 is, I just like to put a little bit of glue just on there first of all, and then I'm going to cover that piece with my fabric, making sure, as I say, that you have got the whole of this paper covered on this left hand side where you've got the margin and the seam allowance, and you are leaving yourself a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the other 3 sides. So you want to place it down with the wrong side down on top of your glue. I think I'm going to go that way, so I think it's going to cover otherwise. That looks better. You can always hold it up to the light. If you turn it round and hold it up to the light, then you can see whether you've covered everything. Once you have placed your fabric on, you just need to flip it back to the right side, and we're going to be looking for piece A2, which is just here. So we're going to be stitching the next piece of fabric on along this line here. So A2 is going to be the green. So it's not going to be a very big piece of fabric for this. So I'm going to cut a chunk off this piece. And then I can use this to pop that down on that area, but we're going to be popping it on the back. First of all, we need to put a crease down this line here, because this is where our stitching line is. So I have a piece of card that's been covered with plastic, and I'm just going to place that just slightly off that solid line and just flip that over and just put a finger crease in the paper. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sew the green onto the gold star. Now I like to trim my fabric away, leaving a 1/4 inch seam here before I stitch this piece on. So you can either do it with scissors, you could do it with a ruler and a rotary cutter, or if you're brave, I'm not saying that I am brave, but you can just do it straight off with your rotary cutter. Just mind your fingers if you are doing it this way. So that's that piece off. And then with this piece, we're going to place that right sides together against the gold star. Now I know that this piece is plenty big enough. If you wanted to double check to make sure that you have got your piece of fabric behind big enough or large enough, then what you could do is if you flip this open, pick up the paper and the 2 bits of fabric, and then flip that over again and just place, well, just put the fold back to where the stitching line will be, and then you can see that the fabric underneath is going to cover the whole of that next shape you're going to stitch onto. I mean, this is a very, very small piece, but as you can see, there is plenty of fabric there. Okay, so we'll just make sure that that goes back, and I'm going to transfer this to under the needle. I'm just going to move it across before I flip it open, because I don't want anything to move. And then I have set my machine with a 1.5 stitch length. You need it short, because once you finish, you're going to be pulling the paper away from the back of the fabric, and you don't want the stitches to come out. So you need to have a short stitch length to do FPP. Now I'm going to do some back stitching, so I'm just going to start a little bit in from the top edge where the 2 shapes meet, and I'm going to go a couple of stitches over the line, going in reverse. Reverse again. So there is my stitching on the front, so that's on the paper, and then if we just flip that over, you can see that the stitching line is just here. So the next thing you need to do is flip your fabric over. You can either just finger press it, or if you want to, you could use your seam roller just to give that a good press down. And then we're now going to move on to A3. If you've used a larger piece of fabric like I have done for this small piece, I'm going to trim the excess away because I don't want all of this sort of hanging around. So I'm just going to flip that over a little bit and be quite generous with it, because you've still got other seams to sew, but we don't want the whole of this piece. So I'm just going to cut it off there, so it'll just get in my way otherwise. So there we go. So we're now ready to stitch A3 onto A1. So again, just using your piece of plastic, we'll just pop that on, or just below that line. Fold that over and just press it down. And then I'm just going to trim this spare fabric away, leaving approximately a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to keep those little bits because they may come in handy for something else. And then we are now looking for a piece of green again for A3. So you still have the piece that you've already cut off if you're using bigger pieces. So we're going to place that again, right sides together. And as I say, we are doing A3. So again, if you want to make sure you've got enough, fold that over, and then make sure that the fabric underneath is going to cover that piece plus all your seam allowances. And that's absolutely fine. So we'll flip that back over. And again, stitch that piece down. So there we have the stitching line again, with a couple of stitches either side into piece A7 and piece A6. So we'll flip that over again and just fold it open. And again, I'm just going to press that down. Again, you've still got quite a bit of fabric there underneath, of excess fabric. So I'm going to trim that again. So I'm just going to lift that back. I'm just going to trim straight across here. So next we're ready to move on to A4. So A4 is the background fabric again. So I've got a little piece there, but I don't think that's going to be big enough. Oh, actually it might be big enough. So we are going to be sewing that onto this line here. So what we want to do first of all is press that open, and you can just, because you're doing such small stitches, where you've stitched over into the next shape, you can just pull your fabric away and it won't undo the stitches. Be gentle with it, but you can just sort of ease it away. So we need to have a seam allowance cut here. And then I've got this piece, so I can just see if it's going to cover this. I'm not sure if it will with the angle, but we will give it a try. So that's my piece on. I'll flip that open. No, that's not going to work that way. Try it that way. It is sometimes worth just trying the smaller pieces because you never know when it might fit, but I don't think that's going to work. Oh, dropped it. No, it's not. Okay, that's fine. So we will cut another piece of the gold to cover A4. So again, I'm going to cut a bigger piece. And I'm going to do it this way around. The reason being is because this is on a funny angle and it needs to cover a funny shape just there. So if I use the longer edge to place on here, then it should hopefully, it'll be enough fabric to cover that piece. So fold that back again and we'll stitch that piece down. There we go. Fold it over, just press it down, and then we're going to be stitching A5 onto A4. Again, we've got quite a lot of fabric there, but what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to fold that back. I'm going to trim that piece off first of all. So A5 is going to be the green. So it is a very small piece, so I'm hoping that this piece here will cover that. So let's give that a try. Yes, that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to stitch that fabric together. Okay, and we've now got a 6 to do on this end. Just ease that back. trim your fabrics away. And this is going to be the gold stars again. And we'll just fold that across. And then I'm just going to cut around that shape just to get rid of the rest of this fabric. Okay, so that's how it's looking on the other side. So this is going to be your right side. So I've done A6 and then we're moving on to A7. So I'm going to do A7, A8 and A9 on camera, but I'm not going to talk through it. You can just watch me stitching the pieces on if you wish. And then once that's all stitched on, we'll come back and have a look on the right side and see how it's looking, and then we'll just trim up this piece. There we have all of our pieces of fabric stitched on to our first part of the cracker block. So I'm going to trim this first of all, and then we can move on to the next part. So I have got my old blade in a separate rotary cutter. If you've got an old blade, you can just swap them with your main rotary cutter if you haven't got a spare one. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to use my ruler. So making sure you don't cut on this solid line, which is going to be the stitching line, you need to cut your fabric and paper away on the small dotted line that's around the edge.
Lights are twinkling, streets aglow, frosty rooftops, dusted snow. Carols echo through the town, steady love all around. Oh, I'm wrapped in Christmas cheer. Hearts are warm when winter's here. Laughter rings out loud and clear. Oh, I'm wrapped in Christmas cheer. Gifts beneath the sparkling tree filled with...
And there we have the first part of our cracker. Next we're going to move on to section B. So B1 is going to be in the green. So we need to find our green fabric. Just check to see if I've got any pieces that will be big enough. I've already cut. I haven't, so that's fine. So I'm just going to cut a piece away from here. And again, flipping that over and using my glue, just pop a piece on there, and again making sure that all of this area is covered, including the seam allowance. And then we're going from B1 to B2. We're going to do B4. Now I'm with my cracker, I have designed it so this straight piece here is going to be in a different colour. So I'm using red for this piece. So it just puts a stripe into the body of the cracker, just as a decoration. Just ease that away in the stitching. And then just trim your excess fabric away. Let's see if this red, no, that won't quite, you can see there, it won't quite cover the seam allowance. So I'm going to have to find another piece, which I have here. So don't need it very wide, so I'm just going to cut a piece off here. And there we go, we can stitch that piece on now. Just open that out, just give that a little press. Okay. I'm going to leave trimming the rest of my pieces for the moment. I'm going to trim them once I've stitched them all together. So we're now going to be moving on to section C, which is this one. So we're starting again with C1, which is going to be the green, and we only need a very small piece for that. So that's not going to be big enough. Rid of that. So I'm going to cut another strip, probably the width of that paper. And then because these pieces are quite small, I'm going to cut smaller pieces. So again, making sure that I've cut the piece large enough to include a seam allowance that would be for this mark here. So we can do that about there. So that's your first piece down on C1. Oh, wrong way round. C2 is going to be the gold bumbleberries. So I'll just flip that back. So this piece here, so again we don't need a massive piece, so again I'm going to cut a strip and again we need to allow for seam allowances to make sure that you've got enough. And then we'll stitch that on the back of the green. And then we're back to the green fabric again, which is C3. Now this is a triangle, as you can see, so we're going to need to make sure that our piece of fabric is big enough, because it's on an angle, that when we fold this open it's actually going to cover the fabric. So, oh sorry, cover the triangle. So I've got this large piece here, so I'm hoping that this will be big enough. So just flip that over. And over again. Just lift that up. Yes, I can see that that will be absolutely fine. There we go. Fold that back. And I'm just going to trim this piece off here. And then we're going to do C4, which is the gold. Right sides together. So we have the last piece of green for this end bit here. Just should be able to use this piece here. So we've got, should be plenty there. Okay. Open that up. Okay, so that's piece C done. So the next section we're going to do is D. So the next piece we're doing is D. So starting with D1, which is going to be the green. So I have my fabric. And just check what piece size. And then we're moving on to D2, which is the gold bumbleberries. So let's just see if this piece is going to be big enough. I think it should be. Yes, should be fine. Let's fold that bit back. That's covering all my edges. So then we're going to do D3. going to trim those bits away. So again, we want a small piece of gold. Don't think I've got any scraps anywhere. No. So I'm going to cut a piece off. I'm going to cut it as wide as the D4 because we can use the rest for that shape. And then I'm just going to cut a small piece from the top for this little triangle shape here. Just make sure I make it big enough. So that's going to go onto there. So right sides together, making sure, if you can, I don't know whether you'll be able to see that, I can just see the stitching line through the paper, making sure that's in your fabric. Okay, and then we've got the big square here to do, which is D4. Okay, and then we're ready to stitch that piece on. Okay, so that's section D we've done. Here are all my pieces ready for stitching together. So this is my first Christmas cracker. I have trimmed all the excess fabric away, but I've kept the paper on because I'm going to stitch the pieces together using the markings on the back of the paper as a guideline, and then I will take the paper out when it's all finished. So I'm going to start with the star in the middle. So you'll need your centre piece and one of your edges. Make sure you've got these pieces round the right way. So that's going to be stitched onto there. And I'm just going to pop a clip on there so that it doesn't move before I get it to the machine. So this is going to be your stitching line, this solid line here. So I'm going to stitch from the top edge. I'm going to back stitch first, but then from the top edge all the way down to the bottom edge and back stitch again. So there's the first piece stitched on. Then going to stitch the top part of the star onto that bit there. There's your second piece, and then we've got the final piece just here to be stitched on. Okay, and there's your first part of your Christmas cracker block completed. So the next piece I'm going to stitch on is this piece. If you want to take the paper out, you can do. You're just going to stitch each piece together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But it's entirely up to you. I like to stitch through the paper because then I know I've got the seam allowance is then correct for all the pieces I'm stitching together. Okay, we've got our little red stripe there. I'll stitch this one on the other side. Okay, and then we've just got the 2 ends to stitch on. That's one done. Okay, and there we have it. So I'm now going to take all the papers off the back, and then once that is done, I'm going to just need to grab them. I'm going to stitch on 2 of the triangles that we have cut out onto each side, which will then make the block into a square. There is my first Christmas cracker all stitched together, and I've pressed it all flat. And now we're going to stitch on the 2 triangles which go on either side to make the square block. So first of all, I'm going to fold this in half to find the middle. So I'll just put the ends together. And then find the middle of the Christmas cracker. And then I'll do the same with one of the triangles. So I'm going to fold this one so it's the print of the fabric on the inside, and just put a crease there. And then taking the cracker and your first background fabric, the triangle, going to pop the 2 creases together. And I'm just going to pop a clip in there for the moment, just to keep it still whilst I get it under the needle. And I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch that on. So I'm going to do that one first of all. Now we have our first side stitched on. So I'm just going to press that open with my fingers because I'm not sure where my seam press has gone. It's probably hiding somewhere underneath the sewing machine. So I'll just finger press that down. And then I'm going to do exactly the same with the other side. Right sides together. Pop a few clips in. I'm using a 2.2 stitch length to stitch this one on, so that's just my normal stitch length that I use for my sewing. You don't need to use your very short one for this because you're not pulling any paper away. And there we have our first Christmas cracker finished. So I'm going to do another one in the green, and then I'm going to do one with red. So the red will be the actual cracker itself, and these stripes here I'm going to do in green, and then I'm keeping the star in the middle in the gold bumbleberries. Now we're going to move on to the Christmas presents, and as you can see just here, I have already stitched 4 of the presents. We're doing these with foundation paper piecing as well, and I've alternated them with a red and a green present, red and a green present. Entirely up to you what you want to do. You might want to do them all the same colour, but I'm going to do my next row in exactly the same way. I'm doing 2 rows because we're going to have 1 row either side of our centrepiece with the crackers. So let's get started on this one. So I'm just going to do 1 present on camera because they're all the same, and it's just your choice of fabrics which you want to put where. So here is my first piece, A1 and A2, and I'm going to pop a piece of fabric which is the gold bumbleberries over number A1. So we'll just put a bit of glue on there, and then just place that first bit of fabric on the top. And then using my card, just going to place that just against the bottom of that solid line. Fold that over, and then just trim this fabric away, just leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we've got A2, which is the star pattern. So I don't think I've got, oh, I've got a little piece there. Don't think that's going to be big enough. Nope. Or that one. Right, so we'll just cut another strip of the star. And then we will cut a piece this way. Yeah, So we'll pop that right sides together. Just give that a bit of a finger press. Okay, so that's A1 and A2 done. We're now going to move on to B, piece B. And B1 is going to be the gold bumbleberries. So again, blue on the back. And then I'm going to pop that piece there. And we want B2, which is going to be the gold stars. So we'll just fold that back. Trim that piece off. And then we're going to put the gold on for B2. I'm just going to see if that's going to work that way round, otherwise I'll need to move it around the other way. That's the fabric. Yes, that should be okay. You can see that that is behind the extra margin that we've cut around the template, so it should cover the seam allowance. Okay. I'll just trim around that piece, just cut the excess off. Like that. So that's B1 and B2, and B3 is also the little gold stars. So we will fold that piece back as well. Just ease that fabric down just to get the stitches and the fabric to lay flat. And then I should just trim the excess fabric off. And then we're going to pop this gold on. I'll just see if that's going to be, not quite, so I'm going to do it the other way. Just want to make sure it is going to cover it. So could we fit it in there somehow, I wonder? I'm just going to move it over just very slightly, just to give myself a bit more wiggle room. Right, let's give that a go. Let's fold that back. I do need to find my seam press, I think. I'll look for it once I've just finished doing this bit. Okay, and then we can just trim the excess off around this last bit. Okay, so that's piece B. The next piece is C. So exactly the same as we did for the others. just going to trim that down a little bit because the seam allowance I left was quite big, so I don't want that much bulk behind there, so I'll just trim that off. And then we'll just unfold that, just press that down and trim that piece off. Okay, right, so we're now on to piece D, and we've got D1, which is the red bumbleberries. Now, I'm not sure whether this piece is going to be big enough, which I don't think it is actually, so we won't use that piece, but we'll try this piece. So we've got D1. And I'll just stick that on to there. And then we're going to do the gold bumbleberries for the middle piece. So I don't think I've got any small scrap pieces for that. So I'm going to cut a strip off this piece here. We'll stitch that onto there. So just opening that out. So the gold D2 onto the red of D1. Open that piece out. Give that a press. I'm just going to trim away the excess of the red and of the gold. Get those pieces out of the way. And then we have D3, which is in the red. So I've cut another piece of the red. So I'm now ready to do D3. So let's just pop that on there. Fold that back. And then I'm going to pop that on the back of there. Just make sure that that is covered, which it is. Fold that back. So D4 is the, oh, let's use that bit actually, is the star one. No, I was hoping to use that bit of scrap, but it's not wide enough. Right, so we've got another piece here, so let's fold that back. go on there. It's only a narrow piece, so it should not quite just there. Okie dokie. Right, so could move it over slightly. See if that will cover it. Oh, in the wrong place. Let's try that again. It's good to try and use up all your little scrappy bits, but sometimes it just doesn't quite work. That's a little bit on the edge there, so I don't think I want to chance it. So we'll leave those two pieces and we will use our bigger piece. Okay. Okay, so that was D4, and then D5 is the gold. This piece should be wide enough, yeah, to fit on there. That's good. Okay, so that's that piece done, and then we've got the last piece, which is E. So I'm going to stitch E and D together first of all. So we want, just make sure they're the same. Oh yes. So we want, we need to trim them down first of all. Sorry, I nearly forgot that part. So we need to trim all the excess paper off to this dotted line. So I'll get that done and then we'll come back and piece it all together. Now I've trimmed all the excess paper and fabric away from my pieces, I'm ready to stitch them together. So I'm going to start with template D and E, and I'm going to stitch them together using the 1.5 length stitch, so then it's easier to take the paper away when I've finished. Pop those pieces together, just pop a clip in there. And don't forget, when you are stitching all your separate templates together, to stitch right to the end of your piece of work, so right to the end of the paper. So that's that piece done. And then the top half, you've got the middle piece with the gold and the stars, and then you've got the rest of the bow. So we'll be stitching it together like that. So I'm going to stitch that one onto there. So that's the first piece done. And then we'll stitch those two pieces onto this last piece here. Okay. So there we have our two separate pieces. I'm going to take the papers out first this time before I stitch the two separate pieces together. I think it might actually be a little bit easier, but you know, there's no right or wrong on how to do it, but I'm going to give it a go this way this time. Once you've taken the papers out, you can then stitch your two halves together. So I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and because those bits on one side are facing inwards and outwards on the second piece, I can butt those two middle pieces together to hopefully get them to sit matching when we've stitched it together. You might just have to manipulate it slightly, which I think I'll have to do with that one. Just push it in and just give it a slight stretch. Don't stretch it too much because you'll stretch it out of shape. But you should be able to just nest those two pieces of fabric together, those two seams. Okay, so I'm going to change my stitch length to 2.2, and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And there we go. And just press your seam to one side. I'm just going to use my seam roller. And then you have got another red with the gold ribbon to do, and then two green ones with the red ribbon. That's what I have chosen to do. So just have another look at the 4 I've already stitched. So I will carry on doing those, and then we will be ready to piece it all together. So I have 2 of the red Christmas crackers, which I've finished, And I've got my 2 strips of presents finished as well. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put the sides on like I have done with the green ones to make them into an 8.5-inch square finished. I have my 4 Christmas crackers finished and I'm now going to stitch them together. So I'm going to stitch them in pairs and then sew the 2 pairs together. This is the way that I'm setting mine out. The finished piece that I'm making today I'm going to use on my Christmas table, and it's just going to have a bowl of Christmas decorations in the middle, or a small Christmas tree. So it's just there for decoration. So I shall get on and stitch those, and then at the same time, once I've done that, I will be stitching my presents either side of the crackers, which will then complete my top. If you wanted to, you could put another piece of fabric in between if you wanted to make it a little bit bigger, and put a strip of fabric or even a strip of fabric in between the cracker blocks as well. I'm just going to sew all of mine together today. There are my 4 Christmas crackers stitched together, and I've stitched a set of the presents on either side. So this is now ready to be quilted and with put the backing on. Now I've decided I'm not going to put any binding on my piece today, so I'm going to stitch my backing on right sides together on the front, and I've got my batting inside those, well, it will be inside those 2 pieces once they're stitched together. So that's on the back of the front piece, and then my backing is going on the top. So I'm going to stitch round with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to leave a gap probably of about 8 inches on one side so as I can turn it the right way round. Once I've done that, I'm then going to do a bit of quilting on the front. I'm not going to do very much, but I should just do some all over. And then to close the opening, I'm going to top stitch all the way round the edge with some gold thread. I'm going to use the gold thread for my quilting as well. So I'm going to do that, and then it will be finished.